good life in a bad world. Some personal reflections on maintaining a positive attitude in this sad and broken place. First of all, some news. I was recently quoted in a Wired article about how tech billionaires have, quote, already captured the White House. You can read the article in the print edition of this newsletter. And if you don't have a subscription, there's a way to actually access a non-paywalled version. So here's an excerpt. Quote, while the Obama administration made itself a friend of the tech industry more broadly, not everyone in Silicon Valley was on board. For some, says Emil Torres, a researcher at Case Western Reserve University and the author of the book Human Extinction, the urgency to exit is rooted in a belief that technological progress is both inevitable and inherently positive, a straight shot to utopia. In this view, Torres says, it is immoral for the government to do anything but, quote, get the hell out of the way and let people innovate. There's another quote in the article as well, but I will skip over that for now. On to the main substance of this post. Quote, every day feels like a funeral. The poignant response I received when I asked my friend, a well-known senior political theorist, how they were doing several years ago. I'm quite a cheerful person by disposition. I'm naturally upbeat and optimistic. If you've ever met me in person, listened to my podcast, or seen one of my interviews on YouTube, you'll know that I smile a lot, always strive to be friendly, something that matters a lot to me, and never pass up a chance to share a laugh with someone. Yet, if you were to ask me about my overall assessment of the world, I'd tell you that the grumpy German pessimist Arthur Schopenhauer was basically correct in claiming that the world is a living hell, a disaster zone, a waking nightmare, a horror show, overflowing with unfathomable amounts of sorrow, anguish, and heartache. So, how are these two things compatible? Shouldn't someone with such a gloomy outlook have, a rather gloomy personality like Schopenhauer did? As Rick Lewis writes in the magazine Philosophy Now, for Schopenhauer was a grumpy old sod. He was a glass half empty sort of guy. He was not merely pessimistic, but also moody and sometimes downright aggressive. Given that just about everyone I know right now is dealing with some kind of mental health challenge, depression, anxiety, insomnia, etc., due in large part to the bleakness of world affairs, I thought I'd share a few pillars of my personal philosophy in hopes that someone might find it helpful. I'd also be really interested to know what strategies you employ to stay sane in this moment of unprecedented global challenges and disheartening political developments. So please do share in the comments section below here on YouTube or on my newsletter, realtimetechpocalypse.com. Comments are open to everyone, not just subscribers. First section, aphorisms to live by. A large part of my worldview can be reduced to 3 aphorisms, words that I live by. These explain how I maintain a generally cheerful attitude despite holding what the philosopher Frederick Beiser describes as, quote, the darkest view of life, that which likens it to hell. These aphorisms are: 1. I might be pessimistic, but that's no reason to be gloomy. This, or a variant thereof, has been attributed to the author Cormac McCarthy, although I've been unable to actually confirm this. Nonetheless, it captures something central to my approach to living. So what if things are dreadful? Why does that mean that I can't laugh and smile? In fact, I'd argue that the worse things are, the more important it becomes to inject a bit of levity into life. It's precisely because the world is so relentlessly terrible that we should chuckle at every opportunity that comes along. Indeed, I see humor, comedy, playfulness, jocularity, etc. as the best antidotes we have for the endless awfulness of this place. As many of you know, I co-host a podcast called Dystopia Now with the brilliant comedian Kate Willett. And I think comedians like her provide an indispensable service to our society in decline, making us laugh, because the other option, in many cases at least, is to cry. This is why my upbeat attitude is not an act. I genuinely love to laugh, smile, and share a joyful moment with others. As the environmentalist Les Knight likes to say, quote, a little levity eases the gravity. 2. I don't believe in hope, but I do believe in duty. Off the bat, I wouldn't say that I'm hopeless, though I would aver to having very little hope about humanity's future, as I've written before. The global predicament, in my evaluation, is unequivocally super fucked. An intentionally silly term that denotes the radical overdetermination of bad outcomes, given the vertiginous multiplicity of existential threats before us, from climate change and advanced AI to the ongoing risks of nuclear war and, of course, the rise of fascism. The reason I love this quote, which I got from the filmmaker Mark Silver, though he attributed it to someone else, is that it foregrounds the importance of morality, which I think is distinct from the psychological state of hopefulness. The idea is this: even if one has no hope, moral duty nonetheless calls one to join the ongoing fight for a better world. Indeed, this duty should be sufficient on its own to motivate ameliorative efforts, even if the chance of successfully improving the world is very small. Echoing comments above, I'd urge that the worse things are, the louder this call of moral duty becomes. It's precisely because the world is a waking nightmare that I personally feel so driven to make things better, however I can, to fight the rising tide of fascism, the tech extremists in the test grill movement of Silicon Valley, and so on. So don't give up. If the world weren't in such bad shape, the imperative to improve it wouldn't be nearly so compelling. 3. Be the change you want to see in the world. A slight variant of Arlene Lawrence's exhortation, be the change you want to see happen. Though often attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, it was Lawrence who initially coined this lovely little locution. I think this saying is brilliant, and I see it as directly tying into 1 and 2. I want to see more kindness and compassion in the world and feel driven by a deep sense of moral duty to help make the world a little kinder and a little more compassionate. Once again, I'd also contend that this aphorism becomes more urgent in proportion to how bad things are. It is, in other words, especially important to be the change you want to see in the world if the world is very bad. The worse our situation becomes, the greater the need for people to lead by example and exemplify goodness, to be paragons of good behavior that others should want to emulate. And just to summarize, since I'll be referencing these 3 aphorisms throughout this article, the first one is, I might be pessimistic, but that's no reason to be gloomy. The second says, I don't believe in hope, but I do believe in duty. And the third is, be the change you want to see in the world. Section 2, hanging out with God. So, what do you think? These 3 aphorisms are fundamental to my personal philosophy, and they explain how I, at least usually, manage to avoid Schopenhauerian grumpiness, despite having a profoundly negative view of the world in general. As it happens, I'm not the only philosopher who thinks the world is kind of awful. Bernard Williams once wrote that, quote, if for a moment we got anything like an adequate idea of the suffering in our world, and we really guided our actions by it, then surely we would annihilate the planet if we could. I vociferously disagree with his comment about annihilating the planet to eliminate suffering. That's the exact opposite of the sentiment behind 2 above. But I think the gist is mostly on point. The world is replete with oceanic amounts of misery, as I show in an article titled, somewhat facetiously, Do We Live in Hell? And I will link to that in the show notes below. Even someone like William MacAskill, a test realist who I'd consider to be an optimist, admits that things are very bad. This is a quote from an interview that was published in The New Yorker a while back. Imagine you're traveling through a foreign country. During a long bus ride, there's an explosion and the bus overturns. When you come to, you find yourself in a conflict zone. Your travel companion is trapped under the bus, looking into your eyes and begging for help. A few meters away, a bloody child screams in pain. At the same time, you hear the ticking of another explosive. In the distance, gunshots fire. That is the state of the world. We have just a horrific set of choices in front of us, so it feels virtuous and morally appropriate to vomit or scream or cry. End quote. Here it might be worth distinguishing between 2 kinds of pessimism: philosophical pessimism of the sort promoted by the ornery Schopenhauer, and empirical pessimism, which claims that the world is an unhappy place for largely contingent reasons that are to some extent under our control. I'm not really a philosophical pessimist. I don't think I accept that life is intrinsically very bad like Schopenhauer does. Or as the second noble truth of Buddhism puts it, life is dukkha, i.e., suffering, unease, or unsatisfactoriness. Rather, I think that what's most terrible about the world is largely the result of human foolishness, greed, and moral indifference. These are qualities that we could potentially change in ourselves if we were to make the effort. At least that's what I tell myself, though at times I waver between this view and something a bit more depressing, that humanity overall really is inherently rather awful. Consider the following thought experiment. You're hanging out with God before he creates the universe, and he asks you, I'm thinking of making people, on the whole, quite selfish, greedy, narcissistic, cruel, callous, power-hungry, and largely indifferent to the misery of others. But I'm trying to figure out what kind of world would likely result if I were to do this. What do you think? So how would you answer God's question? If I were asked, I describe the outcome as a world almost exactly like the one in which we actually live. A world full of wars, genocides, exterminations, exploitation, loneliness, racism, bigotry, and the like. As I mentioned in a previous newsletter article, the 6,000-year history of human civilization is little more than a protracted record of murderous horrors. Open a history book and you'll find one atrocity after another. In contrast, if God were to have asked me what kind of world I'd expect if he were to make people on the whole kind, compassionate, charitable, altruistic, and loving, I describe a world vastly different from this one. Wouldn't you, too? So, perhaps there is a little bit of philosophical pessimism in my worldview, a pessimism about the corrupt nature of humanity. But again, given the hortatory aphorisms of 2 and 3 above, this doesn't in any way deflate my motivation to act. Quite the opposite. The worse humanity is, the more urgent it becomes for one to exemplify things like kindness and compassion. Another idea I think about a lot concerns the question of whether the world is getting better or worse. One's answer depends on how one measures things like happiness and suffering in the world. So-called new optimists, like Steven Pinker, argue that what matters is the statistical prevalence of bad things like murder. But this is obviously wrong, at least in my view, because it implies that one murder should be evaluated as less bad if the population is 1 billion as compared to 1 million. Yet the badness of murder is, or at least it should be, independent of how many murders didn't happen. Hence, what matters aren't the relative or statistical numbers, but the absolute numbers. And as I show in the article that I mentioned before, Do We Live in Hell? Again, a sort of facetious title that's also kind of half serious. There are more people suffering terribly today than ever before in human history. Just consider that 50 million people live in modern-day slavery. About 700 million find themselves in extreme poverty, living on less than $3 every day. And around 800 million, almost 1 billion children, have lead poisoning, which causes permanent brain damage. That's about 1/3 of all children on Earth. If one looks at the absolute numbers, then things have unambiguously become far worse over time. At least that's my contention. This conclusion is, in fact, integral to my mostly empirical pessimism. And it's yet another reason that, in my opinion, there's an immense moral urgency to doing everything we can right now to ameliorate the human condition. Section 3. The moral urgency of activism. When I was just a child, I remember looking around at the world in wonder and awe. What is this bafflingly strange place in which I mysteriously woke up? What is it like? Who are these creatures around me? Are they kind and loving or cruel and callous? I was told by a family friend circa the age of 10 that some people in the world are so disadvantaged and impecunious that they starve to death. And I remember being struck in that moment by the horrifying possibility that the world might not be a very nice place to have ended up. Just as a side note, there are about 25,000 people who perish every single day as a result of hunger or hunger-related illnesses, including 10,000 children every day. So if you do the math, that results in millions every year. Back to the article. This is when I formulated what I'd now call the Schopenhauerian hypothesis. I've said before that the single biggest continuous project I've worked on in my life has been trying to disprove, at least to my own satisfaction, this hypothesis. I absolutely did not want it to be true, in part because, as noted, I am by disposition a rather cheerful and optimistic person. By my early 40s, though, I finally admitted to myself that I cannot, and probably will never be able to, disprove it. The Schopenhauerian hypothesis emerged victorious, much to my chagrin. The question at that point was how to respond. There's several options. One, collapse into nihilism, embrace a defeatist attitude and give up on the world. Two, fall back to asceticism, as Schopenhauer suggested, defect from society, and try to ignore the world as best one can. I actually know someone who did this. They've been living off the grid for many years now, don't follow the news, are uninterested in politics, etc., because they found it all so depressing. And the third option is to fight tirelessly for a better world, become an activist, find ways of effectuating ameliorative change. View the world such that the worse things appear to be, the more driven one is to make them better. I chose the third option, of course, which is exactly what the three aphorisms above are intended to capture. I'm reminded here of a study from 2015 in which the authors surveyed people's responses to catastrophic risks, or at least the perception of catastrophic risks. They found that folks tended to have three responses when confronted with such risks: fundamentalism, that is looking to religion for answers; nihilism, that is turning away from the world; and activism, being inspired to actively change the world for the better. This, of course, overlaps with my own list of options that I just mentioned. The takeaway from the present article, then, is that one should respond to the endless awfulness and relentless injustices of the world with activism. Write, tweet, join a protest, stir up good trouble, etc. Whatever you find to be most effective, given your unique set of skills and aptitudes, and pursue it with passion. I hope this also shows that holding a profoundly dark and deeply pessimistic view of the world doesn't for a moment mean that one must tumble into a nihilistic state of passive defeatism. In fact, one can reinterpret such a view, that is, one can flip the Necker cube, as it were, such that it provides an immense source of inspiration to work for a better tomorrow. That's the article. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the other side.
Wild eyes and wanderings, haunting Cytherism rings, beautiful like lyrics that I used to know. Take another, close your eyes, forget the misery in life.